Can you hear me well?
Yes.
No? I heard some no's. Ann is adjusting the volume up. I'll keep speaking until I get a consensus that, yes, everyone can hear me well.
Yes.
Yes?
Better.
Good. Better. Okay. Well, welcome. I see new faces here. I'm delighted. I hope that afterwards we can get a chance to speak. I'm delighted to be here every Sunday that I'm here, whether I'm in the pulpit or not. I am always filled, thrilled, enlightened, touched to be here. Thank you for being here. I have interesting things to share. I want to read first from a talk that Kedarnath Datta, also known as Bhaktivinoda Thakur, this 19th century religious revivalist of India, a talk that he gave in English to his contemporaries in India. These are the opening words. We love to read a book we've never read before. We're anxious to gather whatever information is contained in it, and with such acquirement, our curiosity stops. This mode of study prevails amongst a great number of readers who are great men in their own estimation, as well as in the estimation of those who are of their own stamp. In fact, most readers are mere repositories of facts and statements made by other people. But this is not study. The student is to read the facts with a view to create, and not with the object of fruitless retention. Students, like satellites, should reflect whatever light they receive from authors and not imprison the facts and thoughts, just as magistrates imprison the convicts in the jail. Thought is progressive. The author's thought must have progress in the reader in the shape of correction or development. He is the best critic who can show the further development of an old thought. But a mere denouncer is the enemy of progress and consequently of nature. Begin anew, says the critic, because the old masonry does not answer at present. Let the old author be buried because his time is gone. These are shallow expressions. Progress certainly is the law of nature, and there must be corrections and developments within the progress of time, but progress means going further or rising higher. I'm not going to read too much more, but there's one concluding paragraph to show you the gist of his thought and the temper of his spirit. Now, if we are to follow our foolish critic, we are to go back to our former terminus and make a new race. And when we have run half the race, another critic of his stamp will cry out, "Begin anew, because the road taken is wrong." In this way, our stupid critics will never allow us to go over the whole road and see what is in the other terminus. Thus, the shallow critic and the fruitless reader are the two great enemies of progress. We must shun them. Now this Bengali man, whose original tongue was Bengali, who spoke Hindi, Sanskrit, Persian, and also, as you just heard, remarkably good English, continues to have an enormous impact in the world that we live in today. Arguably, hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of Western people have accepted the challenge to incorporate a new way of seeing the world, an entirely different worldview than the one that was received by the culture into which we as Westerners were born. It's a worldview that includes concepts like karma and reincarnation, dharma. Remember Dharma and Greg? I mean, how much more, entry into our vocabulary, into our jargon can there be with the Dharma bums and Dharma and Greg? These are great concepts from the Far East. In the 19th century, Bhaktivinoda was born in 1838, not far from Calcutta. He was born in a rural district. He was born from two families, the union of two families, both of which were prestigious and enormously wealthy. His childhood home, there were hundreds of servants. His grandfathers, paternal and maternal, both had homes with hundreds of servants in them. As you'll hear, within less than a decade of his birth, both families were reduced to abject poverty. And there were enormous reversals in his life that were in part responsible for shaping this world shaker. Now, there's a component here that I want to emphasize. When we speak about Bhaktivinoda Thakur, Kedarnath Datta, that's his birth name, Kedarnath Datta. And Bhaktivinoda and Thakur are both honorifics that were given to him by the people that esteemed his religious preaching and construction so much. And that is that Kedarnath, or Bhaktivinoda, was enormously influenced by his association with Unitarians. He deeply admired Unitarians. He pored over the works of Channing, Parker, Emerson, Newman, and they made him hopeful. They gave him direction. They inspired him, and they shaped him. And through his 20s, they were his guiding light. Now, the challenges that faced Bhaktivinoda Kedarnath in his youth are in some ways similar to the challenges that face us as Unitarian Universalists today. What am I talking about? Well, let's look at it this way. Postmodern human beings are challenged to reconcile modern secularism with the rigid religious constructs of the past. So secularism, modern secularism, it's rooted in rationalism. It's responsible for earth-changing, astounding technological advancement. You can Twitter to somebody in China. It's amazing, isn't it? I mean, it's really amazing. I mean, I was born in '48, and I remember TV when it first dawned. And, you know, I watched the video games that a 6-year-old plays now. It's like unbelievable. So, apart from these technological advancements, modern secularism has a mood. Am I no longer? So much for technological advancements. Just joking, folks. Okay. There's a flavor to postmodern secularism, and that is a scrutiny of beliefs from the past, and a tendency to feel that religion has become outdated. Religious ideation, religious language, the belief in some God figure sitting in the sky, dictating or controlling human affairs. There's a lot of distrust and a lot of dismissal of these ideas. Consequently, we hear often, oh, I'm spiritual but not religious. Religion is like a dirty word. On the other hand, you have traditional theologies. They're rooted in faith. They're rooted in values of piety, acts of devotion, intuitive, metaphysical, mystical activities. And these have produced not technological advancements that make life easier in the world, but they have certainly shaped world-changing individuals like Dorothy Day, Martin Luther King Jr., Mohandas Gandhi, Francis of Assisi, Luther. So these are world shakers. And two, in my personal walk, I have encountered many people who have adopted secular humanism or modern secularism and who lament that, well, I didn't believe all that stuff before, but it gave me comfort. You know, when I would pray to a God that I really didn't believe in, I felt good. And I feel better now that I got rid of this false notion of a God I didn't believe in, but I'm bereft of that comfort. Have you encountered this kind of talk? Or maybe in your own heart, this reflection? This tension was at the forefront of the times that Bhaktivinoda Thakur lived in, because there was an incursion of the West, and chiefly in Calcutta, the British presence was enormously influential in India and in Asia. And Bhaktivinoda Thakur, coming from the wealth and prestige that he did, was among the most well-educated of Bengalis, and he had perpetual encounter throughout his youth and throughout the rest of his life with some of the most powerful people representing British imperialism and British and American theology. Let's look a little bit at him biographically. Age 7, he demonstrated so much intellectual prowess as a 7-year-old that he came out first in his class in school and got an award from the local king. And he writes in his autobiography, which I got with a little difficulty because it's only been translated into English by one person that I'm aware of and not available in libraries. But I was able to find it online and have been reading it. In his autobiography, he notes that at age 7, the award from the king puffed him up with so much pride that he stopped studying. What's the deal? And consequently, he began to slip and fail. And he was so chagrined that the palanquin bearer, okay, remember, very wealthy family, so he's brought to school in a palanquin. He would have the palanquin bearer set him down in the woods and pick him up at the end of the school day. He stopped going to school, he played truant. So much for his enormous accomplishments at age 7. By 1849, so he was born in 38, so he was 11 years old. In rapid succession, his 2 brothers died, and soon after his father. At the same time, both his grandfathers became dispossessed. And I want to make a point here. These wealthy landowners who had been prestigious leading families for centuries in India came under the influence of British rule, and they were required to pay land taxes that were so exorbitant. This is what caused the destruction of these families' wealth and income. So this is important to know because I'm going to make a point later that I hope you'll see the connection between our present day challenges and the challenges that were faced by Bhaktivinoda and how he dealt with them. So when he lost his father, lost his brothers, the family lost its wealth, its prestige, put them in a double bind. Because the family was so prestigious, everybody assumed they were enormously wealthy, still, but they weren't. And so, bearing the grief of loss and the practical loss of money was exacerbated by the fact that people didn't know the awful situation they were plunged into. This caused him to really look for meaning in life. Who am I? Why do I have to suffer? Why do people have to suffer like this? Is there a God? If so, what's his plan? From his autobiography. I went so far as to watch the image makers and the priests who installed the idols to see when they came alive. Sometimes I would enter a Shiva temple alone and call out to the idol, but there would only be an echo. I thought that perhaps Shiva was just teasing me, so I would touch him and run away. I thought that if Shiva was real, then he would grab me, give me some pain or trouble, but he did nothing, so I concluded that the idol was useless. At the same time, he had a great desire to eat some fruit in an orchard, but the orchard was reputed to be haunted. So he was afraid, an 11-year-old boy, he was afraid to go into this haunted orchard. A ghost would get him. And there was a Vaishnava priest who told him that if he said the name of God, and he protected himself with the name of God, even if there were ghosts, they wouldn't bother him. And he was terrified, but he made the experiment. And he went into the orchard, and he got the fruit, all the while chanting the name of God. And because no awful thing happened, he acquired some little faith in the name of God as an 11-year-old. At age 14, he was rescued from that situation of extreme poverty, constraint from sharing his grief with others because people assumed the family continued to have wealth and they didn't. At age 14, he was rescued from that by a visit from his aunt to his childhood home of Ula, near to Calcutta. And she recognized his intellectual ability, and she encouraged the mother to release her son to live with her sister and her husband. That would be Kedarnath's uncle in Calcutta. He did. He lived with Kashi Prasad. Kashi Prasad was a journalist. He was a prominent leader of the intelligentsia of the time. Again, pride overtook the young man. He began to excel in public speaking, in writing. He got a lot of recognition. And again, in his autobiography, he talks about the fact that he was getting very elevated in his own esteem. And he might have continued in that way, except that at that time, a cholera epidemic swept through the town of his birth. And again, most of the residents of Ula perished in that episode. And the mother was unwilling to let her child be away from her anymore. And he retired from that milieu that he was in that was making him feel so very proud and so very aristocratic. His sister died in that epidemic, so it was now father, 2 brothers, and sister dead and gone. Prestige and wealth diminished to nothing practically useful for him. Now, I mentioned that in the midst of all this, he was searching for an identity and an explanation of who he was and what reality is and what is the nature of our origin. Where from do we come? And in other talks, so some of you who are here for the first time, you haven't heard the talks that have led up to this, when I described the Bhadralok, the intelligentsia, the literati of Bengal, people of great note like Ram Mohan Roy, who was credited with being the father of modern India, Keshav Chandra Sen, the immediate successor of Ram Mohan Roy, who really expanded the Brahmo Samaj that Roy had founded. Bhaktivinoda was contemporary with these people. The Tagores, Rabindranath Tagore's antecedents were friends of Bhaktivinoda. So at that time, the struggle was, do we reject Indian culture altogether? The British say it's atavistic, it's horrible, it's backwards, it's stultifying. Do we reject it completely and become British? Or is there value in traditional Indian culture? What to make of it? And the Brahmo Samaj, which appealed to the wealthy and the intelligentsia, largely became a spiritual institution and tradition that was devoid of a God figure and devotion to God. And this was very challenging for certain of the Indians who felt that there was value in worship of God and that there is some deity. They had some sense of this. Bhaktivinoda Thakur, again, in his autobiography writes, "In those days, I was with the Hindus, meaning those who elected the theistic answer. I had decided that the philosophy of the Brahmos was incomplete. I also thought that the brotherly philosophy taught by Jesus Christ was best. I felt that the real taste of worship was devotion, and unfortunately the Brahmos lacked this taste. At the time, I read the books by Theodore Parker and other Unitarians, which I obtained from Calcutta." Now, again, he had a very close friendship with Charles Dahl, a Unitarian minister from Boston. He would read daily Channing, Parker, Emerson, Newman, Thoreau in Dahl's room, his reading room, and he would talk over these ideas with Charles Dahl. "From my childhood, I had developed faith and devotion. In particular, I was attracted by the devotion of Jesus. Still, there was that sense of humiliation that people in India felt because the British were claiming that all religion from India was preposterous, backwards, stultifying. So Bhaktivinoda, like so many of his contemporaries, was intent on discovering, is that really true or what? He writes further, "The Shaktas," now these are worshippers of goddess as the supreme being. And he was born into a Shakta family, not a Vaishnava family. So he was born into a family of Shaktas who worship goddess as the ultimate supreme being. The Shaktas would perform a sacrifice and kill animals and eat the meat, but the Vaishnavas would not kill. I remember a Vaishnava named Jack, who used to come to our home dancing and singing and doing Nam Kirtan, with eyes crying like torrents of rain. Nam Kirtan is singing God's name. All these incidents created great faith. When I was sick, the Kartabaj, this is a branch of Vaishnavas, cured me, and I realized the strength of the Vaishnava Dharma. There was substance in Vaishnava Dharma, and it was the bhakti, or the devotion, that gave me the faith. I only saw low activities in Shakta Dharma, and as far as I could see, the Brahmos were without Dharma or Rasa of any kind. Gradually, I came to these conclusions." So, at this time, he really adopted faith in indigenous Indian religion because he chanced upon the book called the Bhagavad that was the supreme scripture of the Vaishnavas. But he still had to reconcile a problem that he was encountering. My first reading of the Chaitanya Charitamrita created some faith in Chaitanya. Chaitanya championed the Bhagavad. He was a Bengali saint of the 16th century. On second reading, I understood that Chaitanya was unequal, but I doubted how such a good scholar with so high a level of love of God could recommend the worship of Krishna, who had such a questionable character. I was amazed, and I thought about this in detail. Afterwards, I humbly prayed to God, "O Lord, please give me the understanding to know the secret of this matter." Now, in the ensuing struggle to get clarity, Bhaktivinoda Thakur carefully read the commentaries of Chaitanya's followers, the commentaries Chaitanya himself made, and he decided that the problem was a complete misunderstanding of Krishna's identity. He accepted that Krishna was God, and he accepted that Chaitanya was an incarnation of God. Now, mind you, this was all happening while he was having these interludes with Dahl on a regular basis, and Dahl was trying earnestly to make him a Christian. And he found that Bhaktivinoda Thakur's thought was so fast, so sure, so keen, and his appreciation of Jesus was so sincere and palpable, he was amazed. This man is not becoming a Christian. I can't understand it. What happened was, Bhaktivinoda decided that Jesus was an appearance of the deity in the West, and Chaitanya and Krishna were appearances of the same deity in the East. And he took from the Unitarians the idea that who cares what people will say in criticism of your intuitive, direct experience of divinity. If you can justify it, if it makes sense to you, if it's palpable, if it moves you, if it is ennobling and enhancing to your ethical and moral behavior, it's a good thing, accept it. And critics be damned. This is what happened for Bhaktivinoda. And I want to read some things here now that show his progress of thought. But before I do that, let me mention one of his first important books, and I do have this book in English, called Krishna Samhita. And what he did with that book is he used the techniques of rational analysis to go through all of the scriptures of India, the Bhagavad Gita. And in so doing, he came to the conclusion that, okay, so traditionally we've heard that these books are 5,000 years old, they're all written by Vyasa. Maybe that's not true. They might be 1,000 years old. And it may be that there were a number of writers who wrote this. Oh, the slings and arrows from some of his contemporaries for saying such a blasphemous thing. But he persisted. He wrote the Brahma Samhita, the Krishna Samhita, and he concluded that there was legitimacy, vibrancy, and value in the Bhagavad and in the teachings of India, but maybe we can't take them all literally, and maybe we should apply rational analysis to them, and they would be useful for going forward in the modern world. Let's see if I can find what I want to read here from his talk. Here it is. Again, this is a revelation of his character. You must yourself knock at the door of the inexhaustible store of truth from which the former ages drew their wealth. Go up to the fountainhead of truth, where no pilgrim meets with disappointment of any kind. Vyasa did it, the author of the Bhagavad. Vyasa did it, and obtained what he wanted. We have been advised to do so. Liberty, then, is the principle, which we must consider as the most valuable gift of God. We must not allow ourselves to be led by those who lived and thought before us. We must think for ourselves and try to get further truths which are still undiscovered. In the Bhagavad, we have been advised to take the spirit of the holy books and not the words. The Bhagavad is therefore a religion of liberty, unmixed truth, and absolute love. Now, I want to counterpose that with something that he had read from Emerson and see the connection between Emerson's influence on his thought and his behavior. From Self-Reliance, Emerson wrote, "A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. With consistency, a great soul has simply nothing to do. He may as well concern himself with his shadow on the wall. Speak what you think now in hard words, and tomorrow speak what tomorrow thinks in hard words again, though it contradicts everything you said today. And so you shall be sure to be misunderstood." Is that so bad, then, to be misunderstood? Pythagoras was misunderstood. Socrates, and Jesus, and Luther, and Copernicus, and Galileo, and Newton, and every pure and wise spirit that ever took flesh. To be great is to be misunderstood. So I want to conclude by talking a little bit about my next Minister's Musings, which you'll read in the newsletter, is called Ferguson is Not About Ferguson. Those words come from Peter Morales. Reverend Peter Morales is the president of the Unitarian Universalist Association, so he's commenting on what's going on in Missouri, and what's going on in New York City, and actually what's going on in Wichita and all over America, where people are, again, questioning, what are we to do as people of conscience, as people committed to ethical and moral behavior? What are we to do? And Peter Morales answers, the question implicit in his title, or in his phrase, Ferguson is not about Ferguson. Well, what is it about? He says it's about the dehumanization of human beings and the treatment of humans as if they are objects. So Charles Merrifield, myself, my wife, Laura Robeson, we represented our church at a seminar on restorative practices. And in that seminar, there was a very interesting construct presented to me. I think it's from a psychologist named Brathwaite. And it's a description of the 9 affects that humans experience. Oh boy, I'm going to have to go from memory here. I have it in my notes somewhere. But the 9 affects, 2 of the 9 affects are positive. Happiness and joy, interest and excitement. These are the positive ones. There's another affect, surprise and startle. Surprise and startle are the reset button. You're surprised, you're startled. You don't know quite how you feel. You want to get your bearings, so it's a reset button. The negative affects are fear, terror, disgust, despair, hopelessness. Braithwaite actually coined a phrase, dis-smell. Like, ugh, the stench is so horrible, dis-smell. And in his discussion, Braithwaite said, here's the thing. Psychologists, neuroscientists have discovered people who learn to go into the positive affects, these people remain healthy, robust, positive in their influence in their own small circle and in the world. Therefore, elect to stay in positive affect. Now, this came up for me as a question, so I put it to the seminar leader, the facilitator. I asked her, I said, so Stokely Carmichael was an associate of Martin Luther King. And after a while, he became disgusted with Dr. King's policy of nonviolent confrontation with the bigots in the South. And he said to Dr. King, how can you arouse the conscience of somebody who has no conscience? This is a bootless and fruitless path. We shouldn't be taking it. So I said to the facilitator, there's some merit in what Stokely Carmichael was saying, but I side with Dr. King. And I wanted to throw in that quote from Dr. King. He said, I have decided to stick with love. Hate is too great a burden to bear. Okay? But so the facilitator said, here's the thing. Sure, there are people without conscience who are capable of the most execrable and odious activities, but even so, if you place all your attention on them and their machinations and their dealings, you're going to reside in those negative affects. Look at the positive. Look at what is good in humankind. Look at the progress. Camp there, and from that position, be an activist. It's certainly not that Stokely Carmichael was an activist and Dr. King was not an activist. Dr. King was enormously active in changing the world. And what he did changed the world in a positive way. I think that he eclipsed 1,000,000 times the contribution that Stokely Carmichael made. They both made great contributions. But Dr. King's was the preeminent one. Why? Because, as he said, I elect to stick with love because hate is too great a burden to bear. Now, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's family was reduced to poverty by the British. He worked for the British the whole of his life as a magistrate. There was a terrorist group in Bengal that he ferreted out, arrested the leader of, and was attacked. His family was attacked physically and verbally from this terrorist group. And in defense of Britain, Bhaktivinoda Thakur worked to get rid of these people who wanted to blow up the British and shoot the British to death. Well, this outraged certain of his contemporaries. But I think it also reflects on the fact that he thought, if Jesus' teachings are great, and Chaitanya, who also advocated nonviolence and love, if his teachings are great, if this is the godly way, then why should I throw in with the people who want to murder these people? Rather, let's reform them, let's educate them, let's learn from them what we can, and let's give them what we have that's valuable to learn. This was what I wanted to say as the takeaway of today's talk. Bhaktivinoda Thakur started a program called Namahat. It was sort of informal, oftentimes rustic, congregational gatherings of people to do the old practices of Indian traditional religion. He had 14 children. He was a family man. He was a poet, he was a philosopher, he was a playwright, he was a novelist, he was a journalist. He had 14 children. One of them, Bhaktisiddhanta Saraswati, founded 64 monasteries patterned after his father's Namahat programs. Siddhanta Saraswati had a disciple who founded the International Society for Krishna Consciousness. And that disciple had 10,000 American disciples. What to speak of a few 100,000 people who were avidly reading the books and attending functions around America and Europe and the rest of the West. In other words, Bhaktivinoda Thakur's idea and act was very fruitful. These are some of the thoughts that I wanted to share. There's more I might say, but it's noon. And there are other Sundays that we'll get together and think about and talk about these wonderful things. Thank you very much.